The black sea of space stretched endlessly in every direction, and in that emptiness drifted a single, human ship moving carefully between sharp rocks of the asteroid belt. The ship was old, its surface marked with burns and scratches from countless journeys, but inside sat a man who still carried courage in his chest. His name was Eli, and he had no companion except the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of his breathing. The stars around him were beautiful, but to him they were nothing more than reminders of his lonely life. Eli had been a pilot for many years, scavenging broken wrecks and carrying small cargo between forgotten colonies. He was not a soldier anymore, though once he had been one. The war had ended, but peace had never truly come, and so men like him survived by taking whatever jobs the galaxy offered that day. He was not searching for riches or excitement. He only wished to pass safely through the asteroid field and reach the next trade hub before his food supplies ran low. But fate often waits for men when they least expect it, and as his scanners beeped softly, he noticed a signal blinking faintly on the edge of his screen. At first he thought it was just a broken satellite, or perhaps debris from some old skirmish, but the signal repeated, weak and slow, like the heartbeat of something that was still alive. His hands tightened around the controls, and he turned the ship toward the source, curiosity and instinct guiding him forward. The closer he moved, the clearer the sight became. Floating between jagged stones was a shattered vessel, its hull torn open and its lights flickering weakly as though the last breath of its engine struggled to keep burning. Eli squinted his eyes, scanning the wreck. He had seen many ruined ships before, and usually they carried only silence and death, but something inside told him this one was different. He activated the docking clamps and carefully pushed closer. Shards of metal scraped against his hull as he locked onto the vessel. The inside of the wreck was dark, almost completely dead, but faint readings suggested a small pocket of breathable air still remained. He suited up quickly, pulling on his helmet and checking his oxygen levels before stepping into the narrow connecting bridge. Inside the wreck, silence greeted him, broken only by the crackle of damaged wires and the hiss of escaping gas. His boots pressed against the cold floor as he moved slowly down the corridor. His flashlight cut through the smoke and shadows, revealing walls scorched by fire and signs of a brutal battle. Then his light fell on something that made his breath stop. Curled against the wall was a figure, small and fragile, her body covered with bruises, her clothes torn, and her skin pale as moonlight. At first he thought she was already gone, but when he leaned closer, he saw her chest rising weakly, each breath shallow and painful. Her eyes flickered open for only a moment, and in that instant he saw that she was not human. Her eyes were larger, glowing faintly with a strange light. Her skin shimmered faint blue under the beam of his torch, and her hair floated gently like strands of silver in the low gravity. Eli froze, staring at her. He had met aliens before, but rarely, and never one like this. Her face carried both strangeness and beauty, a fragile kind of sorrow that struck something deep within him. He quickly pulled a scanner from his belt, checking her pulse and life signs. She was dying. Her oxygen levels were collapsing, and her wounds were severe. Without help, she would not last long. Without hesitation, he lifted her carefully in his arms. Her body was light, almost weightless, and he could feel the faint tremor of her weak heartbeat through his suit. He carried her back through the broken corridors and across the docking bridge. His breath loud in his helmet, he placed her gently inside his ship, sealing the hatch behind them and rushing to the medbay. Medbay was small and old, but Eli had kept it ready for emergencies. He placed her on the bed and removed her broken mask. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she tried to breathe. He connected the oxygen tube and watched as her chest began to rise, a little stronger though. Her eyes still flickered, half closed. He worked quickly, cleaning the wounds, patching the cuts and injecting her with a stabilizer. His hands moved with steady control, though inside his heart raced faster than it had in years, minutes past before. She stirred again, her lips moved faintly, forming words that were strange, yet soft, almost like music. His translator unit struggled but managed to form her broken voice in human tongue. She whispered weakly, asking why he had saved her. Eli leaned closer, telling her simply because she needed help, nothing more. Her eyes opened wider, as though she could not believe his answer, and then she spoke words that shocked him even more. Her voice trembling with desperation, she said that among her people, no one gave life without asking for something in return, and so the only way she could repay him was to offer what her culture called the first night. She said it not with shame, but with sincerity, as though it was the most natural and honorable gift she could give to the one who saved her life. Eli froze, his heart pounding. He could not believe what he had just heard. He looked at her fragile form, lying weak on the bed, her voice filled with both fear and honesty. She believed fully in what she had said. For her, it was not strange, it was survival, it was tradition, it was the only way. She knew how to balance the weight of a debt, and in that moment he realized that this girl had lived in a world so different from his own that even kindness was alien to her. He sat silently staring at her, not with desire, but with sorrow. He could see the pain in her eyes, the desperation that pushed her to offer something so precious when she had nothing else left. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder and told her no, that was not the human way. He had not saved her for a price. He had not saved her for a reward. He had saved her simply because life was worth saving. Glowing eyes widened with confusion, tears beginning to form, as though his words carried a weight she could not understand. She turned her face slightly, trying to process what he said, but exhaustion overcame her, and she closed her eyes. Once more drifting into uneasy sleep, Eli sat beside her quietly, the hum of the ship surrounding him. He felt the loneliness inside him shift for the first time in years, for within his ship now lay a fragile soul who had never known kindness without a cost, and he wondered what journey fate had just begun for them both. The soft hum of the ship filled the silence as Eli sat in the medbay chair, his gaze fixed on the alien girl, who now slept with her chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm. The monitors glowed faintly with signs of life, her breathing steadier than before, though still weak. She had almost slipped away, yet here she was alive because of his stubborn refusal to leave her behind. Eli rubbed his tired eyes, his body still tense from the rescue, but his mind restless because of the words she had spoken before slipping back into unconsciousness. He had fought in wars, seen men die, and seen worlds burn, but never in all his years had someone offered gratitude in such a way. She had whispered those words with trembling lips, offering herself as though that was the only way to repay the act of saving her life. It had not been a gesture of desire. It had been desperation, pure and raw, born from a culture he did not understand. Eli leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath, wondering how twisted her world must be if even mercy carried a price. Hours passed before she stirred again, her eyelids fluttering open, her glowing eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light of the medbay. She winced as pain spread across her body, but when her gaze fell on Eli, she grew still, her lips parted slightly as though she did not know if she was awake or dreaming. He leaned forward, speaking gently, telling her she was safe now and that she was aboard his ship. Her eyes widened a little, then softened with relief, though confusion still lingered in her expression. She whispered again, her voice weak but steady enough for the translator to catch her words. She thanked him, but quickly added that she could not allow such a debt to remain unpaid. Her people believed that to owe life to another was a chain heavier than death itself. So she said again what she had said before, that the only way to balance it was to give the first night, her tone serious, her eyes holding no shame, only a quiet determination, as though she expected him to accept without question. Eli shook his head firmly, though not unkindly, and told her that among humans life was not something to bargain for. He explained that when someone was in danger and another had the chance to help, it was simply right to do so, not because of what one would receive in return, but because it was the right thing. Her lips trembled as she tried to understand. She repeated his words slowly, as if testing them in her mind, but they sounded strange and almost unbelievable to her ears. Her voice grew stronger as she asked why a man would risk his own ship, his own breath, his own safety for someone who was nothing to him. She said that In her world, nothing was given freely, even food, water, or medicine. All things carried a price, and those who could not pay were left behind. Ale listened carefully, his heart heavy with the weight of her confession. He could see the cracks in her spirit, shaped by a life where survival had no room for compassion. He reached out and adjusted the oxygen mask gently on her face, then told her that not everything in the universe must be measured in trade. That kindness itself had value greater than gold, greater than flesh, greater than any treasure. Her eyes shimmered faintly with tears, though she tried to hide them, turning her face away, as though ashamed of her weakness. Ale said nothing more. He only sat there in silence, allowing her to feel the truth of his words, rather than forcing her to believe them. As time moved slowly, she began to speak of her past. Though her voice was faint, her memories spilled out like a stream, carrying sorrow and pain. She told him that her world had once been bright, with oceans like glass and skies filled with silver. Birds, her people had lived in harmony until the Empire came. Warships darkened their skies, and chains were fastened around their necks. Her family had been taken, her home burned. She had been forced into servitude, forced to believe that her only worth lay in what she could give to others. Eli listened without interrupting, his chest tight, as he heard the weight of her suffering she had never known. A gift without cost, never seen a hand reach out unless it was to demand something in return. She had escaped her captors, but her vessel had been hunted and destroyed, leaving her adrift in the void until fate placed her in his path. And even now, even as he saved her life, she still could not comprehend why he would do so without expecting payment. When her voice finally fell silent, Eli leaned closer and told her that maybe this was the first time she would see a different way. He told her that humanity was far from perfect, but there were those who believed life itself had worth, and that to protect it was reason enough. Her glowing eyes locked onto his face, as though trying to read the truth behind his words. Her breathing grew heavier, her emotions struggling inside her chest. She whispered that if what he said was true, then her entire life had been a lie, and she did not know how to live with such a truth. Eli's voice softened as he told her she did not need to carry her old chains anymore, that she was free now aboard his ship, and as long as she breathed, no one would demand the price of her existence. She stared at him for a long moment, her tears finally falling silently, her body trembling not from pain but from the unfamiliar weight of kindness pressing against her soul. She turned her face into her hands, sobbing quietly, while Eli remained beside her, silent but steady, like an anchor holding her in place while the storm of her emotions raged. Later, when the tears had faded, she looked at him again with a fragile sort of hope in her gaze. She did not repeat the offer of the first night, though he could see the struggle in her eyes between tradition and this new strange truth. Instead, she whispered a simple question, asking what his name was. When he told her, she repeated it softly, as though memorizing it carefully, then gave her own name, Lyra, her voice carrying the faintest spark of trust. Eli nodded and said her name, slowly letting it settle between them like a promise, though the universe outside remained cold and merciless inside the small medbay. Something had shifted. Two lost souls had crossed paths, and now the beginnings of an understanding formed between them. Ship drifted silently through the asteroid belt, stars gleaming in the distance, and for the first time in many years, Eli felt that perhaps he was not so alone anymore. The ship continued its slow passage through the asteroid belt, its engines humming softly against the silence of space. Ale had set the course toward the nearest safe station, though the journey would take several days, and in that time he found himself sharing his small world with the fragile presence of Lyra. She remained in the medbay, most of the time her body still healing from wounds, but each hour she grew stronger, and with each passing moment the weight of her presence filled the quiet corners of his lonely ship. At first she spoke little, only answering questions with short whispers, her eyes always watchful, as though expecting him to change his face into that of a captor demanding something in return. Eli did not press her. Instead, he simply moved through his routine, checking the engines, cooking simple meals, repairing small systems, whenever needed, and always keeping one ear open in case she called for help. Slowly the silence between them became less heavy until one evening, when the stars outside burned brighter than usual, she finally asked him why he had left the war, why a man who clearly had the heart of a soldier chose instead to live alone among broken ships. Empty trade routes. Eli paused for a long time before answering, his gaze drifting toward the darkness beyond the viewport. He told her that once he believed war could bring change, that by fighting he could protect the innocent, but war only left ruins behind. It had taken friends, it had taken family, and it had left him with scars too deep to heal, so he had walked away, choosing instead a life of wandering where at least his choices were his own. Lyra listened quietly, her hands folded on her lap, her glowing eyes reflecting both curiosity and sorrow, for though her story was different, the pain in his voice felt familiar to her. That night she began to share more pieces of her past, her voice soft but steady, as if speaking to him eased the weight she carried. She spoke of the empire that ruled her people, their cruelty woven into every law and tradition. She told him how young girls were taught from birth that their worth lay in what they could offer to others, that debts must always be paid, and that to be saved without paying was a crime against honor. Her words cut through Ele like a blade, for he could see how deeply those teachings had carved themselves into her spirit. She believed herself a burden simply for being alive, and that thought filled him with quiet anger, not at her but at the world that had broken her. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer. She asked about Earth, about the oceans and forests he remembered from his youth, about the mountains where snow kissed the sky, and about the cities filled with lights brighter than stars. He told her stories not as a soldier, but as a man, remembering simpler days, fishing by the river with his father, tasting fresh fruit in the summer, hearing laughter in streets filled with children. Lyra listened with wide eyes, every detail a miracle to her, as if he were describing a dream she never dared to imagine. In return, she told him of her own home before the empire came, of crystal rivers that flowed through silver grasslands, of moons that rose together, painting the night in blue and white. She spoke of songs her people once sang to the skies, songs that carried promises of peace and unity. Eli could almost hear the echo of those forgotten melodies in her trembling voice, and he realized that beneath her scars there still lived the spark of beauty, unbroken, though buried deep. One evening, while repairing a panel in the engine room, Eli heard her footsteps approach. She stood in the doorway watching him silently before asking if he truly expected nothing from her. He looked at her straight and told her again that saving her life had been reason enough, but she shook her head, saying that she could not understand such a thing. She had seen men betray even their own families for survival, yet here he was risking his ship and his safety without asking for any return. Her voice quivered with both fear and longing, as though part of her desperately wanted to believe him, but the chains of her upbringing kept pulling her back into doubt. Eli put down his tools and walked closer, telling her that sometimes the greatest gift one could give was not their body or their service, but simply trust. He asked her to trust him, not because he demanded it, but because she chose it freely. Lyra looked at him with tears forming again. Her lips trembling, she whispered that trust was harder for her than anything else, for trust had always been punished in her life. Yet in his eyes she saw no shadow of deception, only a steady light that made her heart ache. That night when she returned to the medbay, she sat awake long after Ellie had left to rest. She stared at the stars through the small window, her mind torn between the world she had known and the one Eli showed her. She remembered the chains she had worn, the cruel laughter of her captors, the cold hands that treated her like a thing to be owned, and she remembered the warmth of Eli's hands when he carried her from the wreck. The way he spoke to her, not as a debt, but as a person. Every memory tangled within her heart, until she no longer knew which world was real and which was the lie. As days turned to a week, Lyra grew strong enough to walk around the ship, though still unsteady at times. She followed Eli through the narrow corridors, watching as he worked, She asked questions about every small thing, about why the lights flickered, why the engines hummed, why the alarms glowed red when he pressed certain buttons. Her curiosity seemed endless, and Eli answered each question patiently, sometimes even with a small smile. He had almost forgotten how it felt to share his world with someone else, but the more she learned, the heavier her emotions grew for every kindness. He showed every story he shared only deepened the ache inside her. She began to wonder if perhaps she could never repay him, not with tradition, not with loyalty, not with anything she had known her entire life seemed too small compared to the vastness of the simple gift he had given her, the gift of life without a price. One night, as the ship drifted in silence, she stood at the edge of the control room, her voice trembling as she told him she was afraid that if he kept giving she would never be able to return enough, afraid that she would remain a burden forever. Eli turned to her, his face calm though his heart heavy. He told her that she was not a burden, that her presence had already given him more than she realized. Her questions, her stories, even her laughter had filled the silence of his ship in ways he had not thought possible. She was already giving by simply being herself. Her eyes widened as his words sank in. She stepped back, pressing her hand against her chest as though trying to hold the emotion inside. She whispered that no one had ever said such things to her. No one had ever seen her as anything but a debt or a tool. Her tears fell freely as she finally collapsed into the chair, covering her face with her hands. Eli said nothing more. He simply sat across from her, watching the walls she had built her entire life begin to crack. Between them hung a fragile silence, filled not with fear, but with the weight of something new. Something fragile yet powerful, something that could change both of their lives forever. Quiet peace that had slowly taken root inside the ship did not last forever, because the galaxy was never kind for too long, and both Eli and Lyra were soon reminded that danger always waited in the shadows. It began with a faint flicker on the scanner, just a tiny pulse hidden among the drifting rocks of the asteroid belt. Eli sat in the control chair, his tired eyes narrowing as the beeping signal grew stronger. He adjusted the screen and felt his chest tighten. The signature belonged to ships. Not one, not two, but several, moving in formation, hunting. With careful precision, Lyra stood behind him, her hands clutching the edge of the seat as she stared at the screen, her breath caught in her throat because she recognized the pattern at once. They were ships of the Empire, the same cruel masters she had escaped from. Her voice shook as she whispered that they had found her. Eli's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm, telling her that panic would not help. They still had time to decide their move, though. In his mind he knew their chances were slim. His ship was old, his weapons limited, and his shields barely strong enough to handle small skirmishes against an Empire patrol. The odds were against them, yet he had no thought of giving her up. Lyra, however, felt the old chains pulling at her heart. She stepped back, shaking her head, telling him that he must let her go, that if she remained on board, they would both be destroyed. She said she could leave in an escape pod, draw them away, and buy him time. Eli turned sharply, his eyes burning as he told her no, that he had not saved her, only to abandon her again. Her lips trembled as she tried to argue, but his voice was firm, cutting through her fear. He said her life had value far beyond what those ships believed, and that as long as she was with him, he would fight for it. For a moment silence filled the room, the engines humming faintly beneath them. Lyra's glowing eyes stared at him, wide and full of confusion and sorrow. She could not understand why he would risk everything. Yet she also could not ignore the fire in his voice. It was a fire she had never seen in anyone before, not even in her own people. Eli returned his focus to the controls, setting a new course, weaving through the asteroids to use the rocks as cover. But the Empire ships were fast and relentless. The scanner lit up with signals closing in from multiple directions. Chase began with bursts of light flashing across the darkness, plasma fire cutting through the void and striking against the asteroids. Eli's ship shook violently as debris exploded around them. Lyra gripped the chair, struggling to stay upright as alarms blared across the cabin. Eli's hands moved quickly over the controls, his face calm though his heart raced. he guided the ship. Through narrow gaps between rocks, dodging deadly blasts by only meters at times, his years of combat experience returning to him in every movement. The Empire ships were well armed, and soon their voices filled the channel cold and commanding, demanding that Eli surrender the fugitive aboard and promising mercy if he complied. Lyra's body froze hearing their words, her old fear rising again, but before she could speak, Eli slammed his hand against the controls, cutting the signal, his voice steady as he told her that their promises were lies. They wanted her back not for mercy, but for chains. Her chest tightened as tears formed in her eyes, because she had expected this, yet hearing him refuse so easily filled her with a strange warmth she did not know how to name. The battle grew fiercer as two enemy fighters closed in on their flank, firing in steady rhythm. The old ship groaned under the strain, sparks flying from the panels as systems overloaded. Eli gritted his teeth, forcing the engines harder even as warning lights blazed red. Lyra cried out, asking what she could do to help, desperate not to remain useless. He glanced at her quickly and pointed to the weapons console, telling her to target the rocks, not the ships. If they could break the asteroids at the right time, the debris might damage their pursuers. Hands shook as she slid into the seat, her fingers hovering over unfamiliar controls, but she forced herself to focus, remembering his steady voice. She pressed the triggers, the cannons roared, and a massive asteroid cracked apart, shards of stone spiraling into the path of the fighters. One enemy ship struck the debris and spun out in flames, the other pulled away, narrowly escaping destruction. Lyra gasped, staring at the screen, hardly believing what she had done. Eli gave a short nod of approval, telling her she had just saved them. Both her chests swelled with a feeling she had never known before, the taste of fighting, not for survival, but for freedom. Yet the danger was not over. More ships appeared on the scanner, larger and heavier than the fighters. A destroyer vessel sliding into view, its dark hull glinting in the starlight. Eli's face grew grim. He knew they could not outrun such a ship, not with his engines damaged. The enemy's voice returned, cold and cruel, giving one final demand: to surrender or be destroyed. Lyra's heart pounded. She whispered again that he should let her go, that her life was not worth his death. But Eli only shook his head, his eyes locked on the looming destroyer as he prepared for what might be his last stand. He told her that he had spent too long running from battles, too long hiding from choices that mattered, and that if he was to die, then better it be here fighting for something true. She stared at him, her tears flowing freely, her chest aching with emotions she could not control. She whispered that she was afraid of losing the only person who had ever shown her kindness. He turned to her for a brief moment, his expression softening, and he said that fear only had power if they let it break them. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving despite it. The destroyer opened fire beams of energy, tearing through the darkness. Eli's ship shuddered violently, alarms screaming across the cabin. The hull groaned as cracks formed along the outer plating. Lyra held onto the console, her body trembling as explosions rocked them from all sides. Yet, even in that chaos, she felt a strange clarity. She realized she no longer wanted to run, no longer wanted to live in chains of fear and tradition. She wanted to fight, not because she owed a debt, but because she chose to stand beside Eli. The old pilot's hands moved with sharp precision as he guided the ship straight toward the heart of the asteroid field, using every rock, every shadow to shield them from the destroyer's fire. He pushed the engines beyond their limits, even as smoke filled the cabin and sparks rained from the ceiling. The battle became a desperate dance between survival and destruction, and through it all two voices carried hope against the dark, one of a soldier who had lost faith and one of a girl who had just begun to believe. The ship shook again as another blast struck the outer hull. Smoke filled the control room and sparks showered across the panels. Eli kept his hand steady on the controls, guiding the failing vessel deeper into the heart of the asteroid field. Behind them, the destroyer loomed like a predator, its weapons burning brightly as it poured fire into the shadows. Lyra held onto the console, her glowing eyes wide with both terror and determination. Every bone in her body wanted to surrender. To fear, yet her heart refused to let go. She no longer wanted to run. She wanted to stand and fight because Ele had shown her that her life was worth more than chains, and fear. The old pilot's face was hard but calm, his eyes sharp and focused as he pushed the ship through narrow gaps between spinning rocks. The engines groaned with every maneuver, panels flickered, and the alarms screamed, yet he did not waver. His mind worked, quickly calculating paths, his instincts guiding him through the chaos. He had fought in battles before, but this was different because now he was not fighting for orders or nations. He was fighting for one fragile soul who had become more important than any cause he had ever served. The destroyer closed in, blasting apart asteroids to clear its path. Lyra turned to Eli, asking in a trembling voice how they could win against such power. Eli glanced at her briefly, his voice steady though quiet. He told her they might not win in the way she imagined, but survival was not always about destroying the enemy. Sometimes it was about outlasting them, outsmarting them, or refusing to give them what they wanted. She listened closely, her fear slowly giving way to trust, because she believed his words even when they faced certain death. The enemy fighters swarmed again, darting between the rocks, firing bursts of plasma. Lyra quickly slid into the weapons console, just as Ele had taught her days before. Her hands shook, but she steadied them, remembering the calm in his voice. She fired at the asteroids, timing her shots carefully until one massive rock shattered into a storm of debris. 2 fighters crashed instantly, and a third spun away in flames. Eli nodded approvingly, telling her she was learning fast. Her chest swelled with pride, though tears still clung to her lashes, because for the first time she felt like more than a burden. She felt like she had purpose. But the destroyer pressed closer, its massive guns powering up for a final strike. Eli's mind raced. He knew they could not withstand another direct hit. Then his eyes fell on the largest asteroid ahead, a giant slab of stone drifting slowly in the void. He made his choice. He told Lyra to hold on and trust him. She asked what he planned, but he only said that sometimes survival meant gambling everything. The ship roared forward, engines burning at their last strength as he aimed straight toward the massive rock. The destroyer fired its cannons, the blasts tearing past them as the old vessel shook violently. Eli twisted the controls at the last moment, diving beneath the asteroid. The destroyer tried to follow, but its massive size made it slow. The asteroid shifted in its path, and with a thunderous crash the warship slammed into the stone. The explosion echoed through the void as fire and metal scattered across the field. Lyra gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, unable to believe what she had seen. The mighty ship of her captors, torn apart not by brute strength, but by the courage of one man who refused to give up. The silence that followed felt endless. Only the broken hum of Eli's ship remained, the engines sputtering, weakly, smoke filling the cabin. But they were alive. Eli leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, sweat on his brow, his eyes closing for a brief moment as relief washed over him. Lyra turned to him, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. She whispered his name softly, her voice trembling with awe and gratitude. She could not stop herself from reaching out, placing her hand over his, as though to ground herself in the reality that he had truly saved them. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze, his expression soft, despite his exhaustion. He told her it was over, for now they had survived, and that was what mattered. She shook her head, saying it was more than survival, that he had given her something she never thought she would find. She said he had shown her a world where life had value beyond trade, where kindness could exist without cost. Her words broke into sobs as she admitted she no longer knew how to repay him, because nothing she had to give could equal what he had given her. Eli listened quietly, then placed his hand gently over hers, telling her that she did not need to repay him, that she was free to live her life not as a debt, but as her own choice. She stared at him wide-eyed, her tears falling faster as she realized the truth of his words. She was no longer a captive, no longer bound by the cruel traditions of her people. She was free, and in that freedom she felt something bloom inside her. A fragile but powerful hope. As the ship drifted slowly out of the asteroid belt, they worked together to repair what they could, patching holes, sealing wires, restarting weak systems, their hands moving side by side, though the vessel remained scarred. It still carried them forward when the stars cleared, and the vast stretch of space opened before them. Lyra stood at the viewport, her glowing eyes reflecting the endless horizon. She whispered that she did not know where her path would lead, but she no longer feared it because she was not alone. Ely stood beside her, his expression calm but thoughtful. He told her that the galaxy was wide and filled with darkness, but also with light, and sometimes all it took was two souls willing to stand together to begin changing it. She looked at him silently, her heart heavy with gratitude and something more, something she could not yet name, but she knew it would guide her from this day forward. She turned and gave him a vow, not of tradition or survival but of choice. She said she would stand by him wherever the path took them, not because she owed him her life, but because she wished to walk beside him freely. Eli accepted her vow with a quiet nod, his chest filled with the feeling he had not known in many years. Hope. Together they looked out at the stars, the silence between them no longer empty but alive with possibility. And though the galaxy remained vast and cruel, they both knew that something had changed, for in that moment, humanity was not just the strength of weapons or war, but the strength of compassion, the power to give without asking, to fight for life without demand, and that was the force that could shake even the darkest empire. And so their journey did not end with victory alone, but with the birth of something greater. Two lives once broken, now bound not by chains but by choice, and together they drifted into the unknown, carrying with them a spark strong enough to light the darkest skies. The end.